Welcome back to the podcast, everybody.
What's up, guys?
We are back. We are without Derek once again. Unfortunately, he has some. The family's sick, and he's doing his thing there. But Nathaniel preached this past week. It was a great sermon. Touched on death and a lot of things surrounding it.
Light topics.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that. But Nathaniel wanted to expand upon a bunch of those things. So we have some questions here, which we're going to dive into, which relate and which were too much for you to include in the sermon. But I mean, death, I feel like we could talk about you could do 10 podcasts on death.
It's fun and also horrible at the same time.
Fun and horrible.
Fun to talk about, horrible to experience.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's just hop right in. First question, Nathaniel, why do Christians die? If Jesus has defeated death, why not defeat it now? And I should ask, I want to distinguish, do we only experience a physical death? You talked about the types of death in the last podcast. Is it a physical death? Is it a spiritual death? What death do we? I mean, obviously we experience a physical death.
Right.
But what goes on?
Yeah. So to kind of briefly recap the part of the sermon that this pertains to, according to Scripture, Christians physically die, but they actually don't spiritually die.
Mm-hmm.
And also, according to Scripture, spiritual death is the cause of physical death, not vice versa. So because we sin, we meaning Adam and Eve and everybody from them, which is everybody except for Jesus, we all have a propensity to sin. And we die, when Jesus says, when God says, the day that you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. They don't physically die, they spiritually die, which again, spiritual death is being cast from the presence of God and being unlike the character of God. Mm-hmm. So it's a character thing and it's a proximity thing. So a question that I didn't tease out that has fascinated me for a while is, if Jesus has defeated death and he has been resurrected and he has undone spiritual death, which is the cause of physical death, why then do people who believe in him, who are united to him by the Holy Spirit, die?
I've never actually thought of that.
Well, yeah. It's so interesting because I think a lot of people think death only in physical terms, right?
Yeah.
But I don't know, just something that, again, Stephen's text, and in addition to a number of other texts, I just was reading in prep for a youth talk tonight, Mark 5, where Jesus brings back to life the little girl. And everyone's like, she's dead. You're too late. And he's like, she's not dead. She's sleeping. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain sense in which that's actually true of every Christian that's died.
Sure.
They are pre-resurrection, sleeping. I don't mean, just a quick footnote here, I don't mean soul sleep, which is the doctrine that you basically become unconscious in your soul until Jesus returns. I don't believe in that, and our tradition doesn't believe in that. We do believe there is a departure of the soul from the body to the presence of the Lord. Caveat. But it's a question that Augustine asked, the way he puts it in City of God, which City of God's great. Highly recommend it. He just is dialoguing with so many questions that you didn't even know you had until you read the book. But the way he puts it is, why death, the punishment of sin? Because again, physical death is a punishment of sin. Or another way you could put it is, why physical death, the punishment or the result of spiritual death? Why is it not withheld from those who by the grace of regeneration are absolved from sin? So another way to put it is, why do we who have been forgiven of sin still suffer the punishment of sin, which is death, right? He gives a pretty long answer, so I'll skip the first part. But he gives it in two. He gives it in two sections. The first part is, he says, and this is something I never thought about until I read him, is that would get rid of faith. And faith is essential to becoming a Christian in the first place. So think about it. If you and I are the first Christians, let's say we're the two women that saw the resurrection, or we're Peter and Paul, and we don't die.
Yeah.
Like, we just never die. People are going to start looking at us and be like, oh, I want what they have. And they're going to come to Jesus not as an end, not as for his glory, but basically as a get out of jail being death, get out of jail free card.
Out of like selfish motivation almost.
Exactly. Which, side note here again, but some people already do with Jesus.
Sure.
They come to Jesus for like hell insurance, which is, again, maybe a separate conversation, but it would only be amplified if Christians didn't die. And so I think it's a really good point. The first time I read that, I thought, okay, that's a dumb reason. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, that makes sense, because you can only become a Christian through faith. And faith is longing for things not seen, right? It's a hope for the things that you don't necessarily witness with your eyes. You don't have a case closed argument with it. And faith by necessity is believing that Jesus is who he says he is.
Yeah.
It's faith. Let me put it another way. Faith is centered on Jesus. But if you make it obvious, and this is, to the people that are like, why does Jesus not like make it insanely obvious? Why not just, show up again? It's because if you don't have faith, then you're going to try to use Jesus for whatever you wanted. People that have faith often are desperate. They've seen through the false promises of everything else, and they see into the beauty of the gospel. And so Augustine, first part he says is, if you don't have faith, then people would come to Jesus for their own purposes. They would basically say, I want immortality, or basically, I want to live forever without God. I want to use Jesus to live forever, but I don't necessarily want to live forever with him. So they would basically be wanting the kingdom without the king.
It's basically the sin in the garden repeating itself, right? Like wanting to be in the place of God, living eternal as God.
That's a really good point. And, I'm not sure Augustine talks about this, but to that point, like Adam and Eve were called to have faith, right? When God said, do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he makes the covenant of creation, the covenant of works with them, there was an element of faith. They had to trust in his word. They had to trust that if they obeyed, they would get life. They had to put all their focus on him. Now, if you take out faith, then again, you're basically saying you're sinning because you're trying to get life without God. And that's ironic because it's impossible. Because again, true life is not just the elongation of your pulse and your body and your breath, and you're like not physically dying. True life is being with God and being like God. And so if you get rid of faith, you actually can't be like God and you can't be with God. So another way to put it, the first part is it's an oxymoron.
Sure.
It's not possible. And God knew that. So God did not get rid of physical death for even believers, because he knew it would get rid of faith. The second thing that Augustine says, and this is really interesting, and it honestly goes back to our discussion from last week, that a world, if you remember, if you didn't listen last week, what we had said is the reason why God allows pain and suffering and he allowed sin to enter the world is because a world that is fallen and redeemed is better than a world that had never fallen at all.
Yeah.
Augustine will make a similar argument about death. I'll summarize it and then I'll quote it at length. A Christian that dies and is brought back to life is more glorious of reality than a Christian that never dies at all. And I'll just quote him. He says this, but now the greater and more admirable grace of the Savior, notice those words, greater and more admirable, the punishment of sin is turned to the service of righteousness. For then it was proclaimed to man, if thou sinnest, thou will die. Now it is said to the martyr, die that you may sin not. Augustine's so poetic. I love this stuff. Then it was said, if you transgress the commandments, you will die. Now it is said, if you decline death, meaning if you say, I'm going to try to avoid death for my own sake and not be martyred if it comes down to it. If you decline death, you will transgress the commandment. That which was formerly set as an object of terror, that men may not sin, is now undergone if we would not sin. Thus, by the unutterable mercy of God, even the very punishment of wickedness has become the armor of virtue, and the penalty of the sinner becomes the reward of the righteous. For then death was incurred by sinning, now righteousness is fulfilled by dying. In the case of the holy martyrs, it is so, for to them the persecutors proposes the alternative, apostasy or death. For the righteous prefer by believing to suffer what the first transgressors suffered by not believing. For unless they had sinned, they would not have died, but the martyrs sin if they do not die. The one died because they sinned. The others do not sin because they die. He closes with this. I'll skip a line. Not that death, which was before an evil, has become something good. So that's a huge caveat. He's not saying death is good, but only that God has granted to faith this grace, that death, which is the admitted opposite to life, should become the instrument by which life is reached. So again, to summarize in a different way, it is more glorious and more beautiful if death is not obliterated, but ironically reversed as the pathway into life. It's almost like every great story. What's the better story? The main character doesn't fall, or is the better story the main character falls, but then the fall ends up becoming the foil for their redemption, and not even just their redemption, but their deeper transformation. And again, I think it goes back to the principle from last week of Felix Culpa. Our resurrected life will be better than the life that they had in the garden. Because as Augustine will say elsewhere, they were able to sin and able not to sin in the garden, to whereas we will not be able to sin in the new heavens and new earth, not because we'll be like puppets, but because we no longer will want to. We will have tasted the true consequence of sin, which is death. And because we have died, we will want to choose life, unlike Adam wanted to. Adam was, he could have gone either way, but we who would have tasted death and tasted life will see which is better, not just in a theoretical way, but in a, actually having tasted both. Yeah. And I also think you could make this is a separate comment that Augustine doesn't talk about, but you could make the point that in order to be fully conformed to Jesus, we also have to die like Jesus. There's no path to resurrection that does not include death. I think that's maybe a third reason. I'm sure Augustine talks about that somewhere, but he doesn't talk about it in that section that you could add on to the three reasons. So why do we die? We need faith. Faith would get rid of the possibility of being united to Jesus if we never died. Two, it's more glorious to have death reversed rather than abolished entirely. And then three, in order to become like Jesus fully, we have to walk the path that he did in our place as our substitute, but also as our example.
There's like 100 little questions that could come off of this. I'm going to spitfire a couple, and you can take if you want to answer any of these. I'm thinking about, okay, there are a few people, you can tell me which ones, because I forget, who didn't physically die throughout, like in the old, is it Elisha? Did he not die? Or
Elijah.
Elijah.
I think.
Elijah. Yeah, I know. But like, ascended into heaven or whatnot. Right. So there's things like that. I don't know if this really even applies or if there's anything to comment on it. I guess some of those points, they still hold true, because it's like, if it's not the main way throughout, that it's affecting everyone, then it's not going to change everyone from going from a faith-based, from a selfishly motivated, I don't want to die base, because it's not like it's true for everyone. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Or
I need to think more about that. That's another area that's utterly fascinating to me. Enoch, right? He walks with God and he was not. And you're like, wait, what? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Elijah, I'm pretty sure, I feel like I need to look this up, but I'm pretty sure it's Elijah. I always get Elijah and Elisha mixed up. Part of me is like, did they both walk
I'm
with
just
God?
gaslighting you. I'm just like,
exactly.
I'm like, it was Elisha.
I feel like there's one other, but maybe
I feel like so too.
I'm blanking on it, who it was. But yeah, you do get this sense that there is this mystery that I'm not sure. I'm sure Augustine talks about it in the City of God. I just don't remember where. Like, why did they live longer? And then their life.
I think Elijah and Moses. Did Moses?
I think Moses died. Yeah.
Moses.
You're thinking of
Mount
Transfiguration. Yeah. Elijah and Moses were up there.
Right. Wait, we don't have to do our.
Yeah. It was one of the two Eli's.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Moses died because he didn't get to see the promised land.
Yeah. So I don't know why those two. You have this sense that they're righteous.
Yeah.
Right. But obviously they had some kind of sin. So did God grant an anomaly for them? Meaning like they already had faith. Maybe he conformed them to Jesus's suffering in a different way. You also don't know if, like, did he just take them in a way that, like, was death, but a different kind of death? I don't know. I'm sure
there's endless speculation here.
Yeah, I'm sure there are people.
I almost wish we didn't go on that tangent. So
no, you're good. That's a good question.
It was just what came to mind. Let's move on to, you talked a lot about death in the sermon, and we were talking beforehand. The question that I was going to ask was, how can how can conversations around death be evangelistic? Or we were trying to come up with a way to say that, and we don't know if that's the best way to say the question. How can it be, what happens on a deathbed that you feel like is a good opportunity for evangelism, or if there's a better way to put it, what would that be?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a way to ask the question, but the idea being, a lot of people say that their neighbors don't feel some kind of need for the gospel. If the old cliche maybe 70 years ago was, I know that I'm guilty and I know that God is the right way. I don't want to be right. But there isn't that impulse as much anymore. There isn't this God-sized hole, if you will, to use like an often quoted phrase, in our hearts. And so I often hear, and I don't know if you hear this too, people say, I don't think my unbelieving secular friends have a felt need for God. There's not really an interest. And I would say part of the reason is because we don't think about death enough. And when I say we, I mean most people in the Western secularized world. And I think death is the smelling salts of secularism, right? Where, whatever the opposite of chloroform. Is it chloroform?
Chloroform, yeah.
Yeah. Like chloroform puts you to sleep, which I think is the vast majority of things we do on our day-to-day lives are spiritual chloroform. Social media is chloroform. Podcasts are chloroform. I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying they numb our mind. They might provoke us to think, but they just keep us busy. Think about everything you do in a day. It's chloroform. It basically numbs you, or at least preoccupies you, to not think about the big things in life. And again, Charles Taylor has an incredibly interesting discussion on this in A Secular Age, where he says, he has this term called the immanentization of society, that we are all living within an immanent frame more and more, because we are so distracted, because we are being shaped by stories which are only concerned with this life. Very few of us ask these big picture questions. What is the meaning of life? What happens after death? And if we do, we often look for the answers in immanent forms. So crystals, astrology. We try to find ultimate answers or answers to ultimate questions in temporal, earthly, I'm using earthly very broadly, stuff. We try to find a word that he calls fullness, like this overwhelming sense of joy, what C.S. Lewis would call Sehnsucht, from the German, this panging that there's something more. He says that we try to find the outlets for that in this life. And another reason why that's even possible is because of our consumeristic culture.
Yeah.
You can always find another new car. You can always find another new possession, which you can try to find ultimate joy in. There's always more to do. You can always work up higher in the ladder. And so anyway, all of this kind of creates this domino cascading effect that most of us don't think about death. And you can even point to practical stuff. Most people do not have someone in their home dying, to whereas 100 years ago, and every society since, you saw death all the time. Whether the whether it being the child mortality rate being far higher, almost every family had a kid that died. You didn't have nursing homes, right? Or at least the modern form of nursing homes. So you saw your grandparents die, you saw your parents die, you saw your uncles and aunts die. The village was much more close, by and large. You didn't move off and form new relationships every 5 years. So you saw, basically, if you lived long enough, you saw a whole lot of people die. Plagues in modern medicine wasn't as good. So, and plagues captured a lot more people. Like the Black Plague, I think it is 1 in 3 people died in Europe, which is insane. So 33% of the people you knew, if you were in, late medieval Europe, died.
Yeah.
And so they are like the one thing that stands out to me about particularly the reformers and really any theologian pre 1700s, I would even say maybe pre 1900s, they spend so much more time talking about death and suffering because it was practically so much bigger a concern. And so let me bring all this back. I think death can be the smelling salts for a lot of us, because I think most people are not thinking about death until someone they know dies. And I think what we need to do as Christians is give people who do not believe in Jesus or the resurrection categories for how they're experiencing death. Because no matter how much you want to say death is natural, no matter how much you want to say, death is, it makes sense because it's survival of the fittest, it's a dog eat dog world, it doesn't make sense. If anything, if evolutionary biology explained everything, as some people say it does, then we should be getting less and less concerned about death, because we would want to shed that lamentation feeling, because it doesn't help us, right? It doesn't help us survive to only lament, right? It actually does the exact opposite. People will often kill themselves and get incredibly sad for long periods of time over loved ones dying, right? And so I think we need to lovingly and compassionately say it is okay to lament. And if anything, death shows us that it shouldn't be this way. I think the person who did this best, of course, was C.S. Lewis, where he said death should awaken in us this reality that there's something outside of this world that nothing in this world can satisfy. And he has this wonderful quote, kind of a long quote, but this is from a couple different places and I tried to trim it down, but he said this: most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. The longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, first think of some foreign country, or first take up some subject that excites us, are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. This is interesting. He says, I'm not now speaking of what would be ordinarily called unsuccessful marriages or holidays or learned careers. I'm speaking of the best possible ones. There was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing which just fades away in the reality. Apparently then, our lifelong nostalgia, our longing to be reunited with something in the universe from which we now feel cut off, to be on the inside of some door which we have always seen from the outside, is no mere neurotic fancy, but the truest index of our real situation. And to be at last summoned inside would be both glory and honor beyond all our merits, and also the healing of that old ache. I love that phrase, that old ache. What he's saying is this: you want something that nothing in this world can satisfy. And death is the obvious door slamming closed in your face that you're not going to get it. And as he puts elsewhere, if you have a longing, an eternal longing, a deep longing that's persistent, that nothing in this world can satisfy, and death seems to confidently put it to an end, doesn't that tell you that there's something after death? Doesn't that tell you that there's something that is outside of this world that is the object of your desire? And I think we really need to come alongside people who do not believe in the resurrection, that have had people that have died, and really say, do you not long for something more? You don't long for your parent or your loved one to be fertilizer. You long for them not just to celebrate what has happened, but you long for them to come back. You see this in the movie Interstellar, actually, where they're if you remember, I'm blanking on the characters' names, but Anne Hathaway and Matthew McConaughey are Cooper and Brant, that's what their names are talking about the guy that Anne Hathaway's character loves, if you remember.
Yep.
And she makes this comment: love is the one thing, other than gravity, which is funny, that can transcend dimensions, time and space. We love people who are dead. Whereas, and Matthew McConaughey's character makes this stupid comment, and he later repents of it, I think, in his actions. But anyway, I'm not going to go into a comprehensive summary of my analysis of Interstellar. He says, love has social utility. And Anne Hathaway makes the comment, we love people who are dead. Where's the social utility in that?
Mm.
And I think that's a good C.S. Lewis-esque point there, that you love people that you know you'll never see again. Why would you do that if we're only brains on sticks, if we're only impulses? That there would be no social utility in that. So that tells us that maybe the people we love do live on in some way. Maybe we're coming back in some way. And I think your average secular person, and I think honestly, your average Christian has not come to grips with what they actually believe.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is, I don't think your average person that doesn't believe in life after that death has actually really set with how meaningless death then makes life.
Mm-hmm.
If everything you've ever done will be obliterated, absolutely and utterly obliterated by death, to whereas no one will ever remember you 500 years from now. The sun will blow up. The universe will contract, in the great slurp, as they call it, or the great freeze, or what. There's like 5 different ways the universe is going to end, but none of them are good. If that's really the case, then I love the way Tim Keller put it. If your origin story has no meaning, we're here by accident. And after we die, after the universe, blows up, or the sun takes out the earth before that, and therefore there is no meaning at the end, he says something really powerful. He says, have the guts to admit that your current life is meaningless too. Most people don't live as meaningless because most people don't think about death.
Mm.
Most people are trying to find, again, Charles Taylor's phrase, ordinary human flourishing. I can make my own meaning, right? It's like, no, you can for a bit. But if you know that it's going to end and no one will be around to ever remember, I don't think we really sit with that enough. And so I think death can then be the smelling salts to say there has to be something more.
Yeah.
To the point last week, to make people want there to be something more, and then to say, is it true that there is something more? Anyway, sorry, interrupted.
You didn't interrupt. I interrupted you. And now I forgot what I was going to say. Well, I was going to say a couple things, so I can just say you started that whole thing out by saying like we don't think about death enough, but I've heard you say in general, kind of like we don't think enough.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and to your credit, I've felt in a good way convicted about this over our conversations, or over hearing you preach and whatnot. You have this theme about you a little bit, Nathaniel, where you're like,
I love death.
No, like be
though.
conscious of the distraction of the distracting world around you, the distractions. I am one of those guys who historically would like to just always have a podcast on in my ears when I'm doing dishes, when I'm doing things, and just being conscious of that and then saying, okay, now when I'm sitting here, like just sit and don't listen to anything, put the phone away. And like, I pick my kids up from school, they're playing at the park and they're just off by themselves. So I'm in the park by myself and I'm like, okay, I'm just not going to look at my phone and see what happens when you're just sitting alone in a field, and forced to kind of just think. And like you said, this world is so full of distractions. Those immediate kind of dopamine hits of distracting from moment to moment to moment. And like you said, then you get to these points and it's death can be the smelling salts of life and wakes you up to it. Yeah. And when you were talking, I looked it up because I wanted to make sure I had this right. But do you know who Francis Chan is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Francis Chan, who's like one of those guys who you can just, whenever you hear him talk, you can hear he's just like on fire for Jesus and whatnot. Sure. But one thing not everyone realizes about Francis Chan is like he was very impacted by death from a very early age. His mother died while giving birth to him. Right. So died in labor. And then his father remarried. And then when he was 8 years old, his second mother, she died in a car accident when he was 8. So he's essentially at that point kind of raised by his grandmother. So very like, I think some people much earlier than others in a positive or negative way have that facade kind of ripped away. Yeah. And they're saying like, look, he can't live through life and ignore the fact that one day he's going to die because his life is so marked by death. Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, we tend to also, we tend to also kind of shelter our minds and thoughts from death, right?
Yeah.
Like I think like you were saying, everyone is so surrounded by death historically. I was thinking about this like 2 weeks ago, my dog was killed by coyotes, right? Bongo.
Justice for Bongo.
Justice for Bongo. But I'm thinking about how do I communicate this to my kids, right? And there's a lot of instincts and to say like, oh, some people might take the approach, oh, we sent him to a farm. We sent him to what? Like hiding him from the death and the reality of it. And I'm like, no, they should know that he died.
Yeah.
And not only that, like I wanted to tell them that it was a coyote, that something out there killed them, and kind of just a little, not that our kids aren't aware of the brutality and the fallenness of this world, but just to be conscious not to just shelter them from the kind of deep, powerful meaning things that impact us.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, it's something too that like, let me put it this way. I was with someone a couple months ago that was a couple hours from dying, and this is one of those. It's almost like a holy thing, so you almost don't want to talk about it.
Sure.
But I'll venture, hopefully for edification's purposes. When I was in that room, and the woman was so close to death, you get the sense that like they're passing, and this person was a Christian, they're passing into glory. And you almost get the sense that it's like, this is the realest thing that happens in life is death. And when I say realist, just sometimes you're in a room and you're like, man, everybody's being so fake right now. Like if you go to a club or you watch a movie or sometimes you listen to music and hopefully a non-pious, pharisaical, judgmental way. It's not like, ooh, I'm better than this, but just like, come on. Like there's a great rap song by Lecrae called Nothing. And he's just basically saying, he's critiquing a lot of rap, basically saying, we ain't talking about nothing. Like the whole song is like, yeah, you bought clothes, it's like, who gives a crap? Ain't nobody talking. And he just he keeps going critiquing, like, why aren't you talking about real things? Like people being born. There's just, when Jasper was born, there was a sense in which I was like, this is the realest thing I'll experience. I think you see it at weddings when people are heaven gets a little closer. I would argue that it happens every time we take the Lord's Supper, but death is this interesting thing where it's real in two ways. You're like, one, like this person is passing out of life. And Augustine will in book 13, which I read from in City of God, basically say that every single moment we live, we are dying. He teases out this paradox in a beautiful, powerful way for a long time. Just basically being like, we're never really truly living because we're always dying. From the moment we are born, we're always approaching death. And the second reality is, to quote the movie Fight Club, it makes you realize, that you're sure, without a doubt, that you're one day going to die. And that's something that, again, I think we all know we're going to die in a theoretical way, but it's so distant from our hearts. And I think if it were closer to our hearts, we would long for something so much more. Not even just death, but like all the inconveniences and sufferings in our life should point us to the day that God will make all that is sad become untrue. Not just death is, I think, the ultimate example of a pointer to ultimate life, but I think even stubbing your toe, getting a traffic ticket, all these things are meant to point you to, oh yeah, I'm on a boat to the promised land. I'm not there yet. This is not my home. That's an Augustine metaphor. Or I'm trying to make my nest in a tree that's coming down. I need to go make it in a rock.
Yeah.
That's not going to. And Jesus is shaking the tree, not because he's ticked off at me or trying to annoy me, but because he's trying to remind me, you can make your nest here, but don't make it permanently. You can have children, you can have a job, you can do all these wonderful things, but they are not your capital H home. They are not your capital L life.
Yeah.
Don't build your rock on them. Love them, cherish them, be thankful for them. Don't idolize them.
that also makes me think of, again, Francis Chan has a story of and he has a story about being at, I think it's a movie or a play with his grandmother, and he turns to her and she's like, "Oh, are you enjoying it? Are you having a good time?" And she turns to him and she's like, "Yeah." And he can like sense she's not fully happy or whatnot. He's like, "Is there anything wrong?" And she says, "I just don't know if this is what I want to be doing when Christ returns."
Mm.
And I was like,
Mm.
when I heard that story, I'm like, that is someone who lives with the weight of reality of Christ and Christ's return, and like the reality of what this world is.
Yeah.
And she's living out of that truth
Mm.
the way that probably I ought to more,
Yeah.
right? Like you asked a question in this past sermon, you said, how would your life look different if you knew verifiably that Christ, was not God, right?
Mm.
But kind of the reverse question is also true, is, where are you not living fully in light of that truth?
Yeah.
Right? Like we don't let that weigh in fully on us.
Yeah. I think the area that you see that most clearly is we invest far more into possessions than we do people. Possessions are going to burn. There's not a single possession that will make it into the new creation that we have now. There's not a single person who won't make it into the afterlife, whether that's with God or without God. And I do this all the time. I mean, it's in like 1,000 little ways that we do not treat people as if they are permanent. And again, of course, C.S. Lewis has that phenomenal writing on, I think it's in a sermon, The Weight of Glory. You've never met a mere mortal.
Yeah.
Everyone's either going to become a creature so horrid that if you saw it now, it wouldn't enter your worst nightmare, or someone so beautiful that if you saw them now, you'd be tempted to worship them. Right? Or something. He says it more dope than that.
Yeah.
But anyway, I could go on for a while, but I'll just say this. Our society is not just set up to distract us. It's set up to dehumanize us.
Yeah.
And to dehumanize one another.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I walk through a grocery store, and 9 times out of 10, we don't talk to a single soul in there. And I'm not saying like everybody needs to go to the grocery store and like not leave until they have 3 people that have said the sinner's prayer. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, like, what would change if we actually believed that every single person we encountered was permanent? And again, they're going to die, and the flip side of that being, I just think we would invest a lot less emotional, financial, and chronological or time resources into possessions. Possessions are not bad at all. They're gifts, right? They're good things to be stewarded, but I think so often, especially in our consumer society, become ends in of themselves. Which I think kind of gets to the last question.
The last question, does death make all my other investments, that's, for example, family or career, does it make all those things meaningless? If Jesus is the only one who can undo death, why care about anything else at all?
This is something I've wrestled with for a long time, because I've wrestled with, like, do we just say that, to live for Jesus is to give everything up and follow him? I've wrestled with it since I talked about this in Sunday school a few weeks ago, The Life of St. Anthony by Athanasius, where he heard a sermon by someone. He's 200 to 300s. So a long time ago, Jesus saying, give all you have to the poor and follow me. And he did it. He went and lived in the desert, and basically his whole life, he just spent praying, battling the lust of the flesh, the schemes of the devil, and fleeing the patterns of this world, renounced all possessions. And I've often wrestled with, like, are we doing it wrong?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You wrote that question, so this question here, and are those things mutually exclusive though, right? Like those investments in family,
right?
Those going to work and working in a quote unquote godly way, right? are those things separate from meaning or separate from bringing God glory, right?
Exactly. And that's where I read Anthony before I read Augustine.
Mm.
And I think Augustine really does have a helpful perspective on it. Because to your point, I think one thing I said that was misleading on Sunday, maybe nobody took it this way, but I made the comment like about retirement portfolios,
Yeah.
or I guess any kind of investing. There's only 100%. There's only 100 points, right? And I was like, Jesus needs to be 100, or I said something like that, not 20, 20, 20. The misunderstanding that could be taken from that is therefore you're completely apathetic about possessions or family or career or having fun, right? And I hope nobody took it that way. Augustine's framework is you have to have something that's ultimate. And everything, you can only have one thing that's ultimate. And every single thing you do is oriented to that. And what he basically says, some people are not going to like this language, but I think it's helpful, even if it sounds harmful. He says, you use everything that's not ultimate. So he says you use people. The reason why some people may not like that language is that sounds bad. He doesn't mean you use people, you dehumanize it. And what he means is use is I love. So if I love you, Matt, Augustine would say I should use you. What he means by that is I should love you unto God's sake. You either use something or you treat something as ultimate. So again, he doesn't mean use in a derogatory negative connotation. He's basically saying, I should not love Matt as my friend as an ultimate thing, because then my love for you would be dependent upon you. So if you started just going off the rails, or you severely offended me, or even if you moved, if something you did changed, then my love for you, if it was contingent upon you, would also fall with it.
Oh, yeah.
But if I love you for God's sake, then I can love you even when you're doing great or when you're doing horrible. Now let's apply that to you can apply that to almost anything.
Sure.
If I do my career for my career's sake, or for my own identity, or for my own financial security as the ultimate reason, then when my career falls, my identity will be crushed. My joy will be totally gone. Same with, you could apply this with anything, with your family. But what Augustine said is not, you don't love everything else. You love everything in an ordered fashion. And, ordo salutis, the ordered loves. And something is what he says is the telos of all your loves. Something is ultimate. Something is the governing principle. It's the foundation. He uses a lot of different terms. And all the other things are used for that end, to direct it. So if you love others for your sake, it's not actually love, Augustine would say. So here's how I want to say that. The only way that you can actually have a good career, the only way that you can have a healthy family life, the only way that you can actually enjoy creation is if you enjoy all of them for God's sake. And let me just tease out one example. If you have a family and you want to say, my ultimate goal in life is family, it's going to crush you because, again, I mentioned this on Sunday, but just want to unpack it. They're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to watch them die. They're going to watch you die. And that's going to crush you. You're not going to be able to get through their death. Or even before they die, you're going to be looking to your kids to basically justify your existence. So you're going to be suffocating them with expectations. You're going to be wanting them to go to an Ivy League, or else it's going to hurt you. And then you're going to be putting all these, you're going to try to squeeze them so tightly that they're actually going to slip through your fingers, or you're going to suffocate them. And therefore you end up ironically losing the thing you idolize. I was reading Jeremiah the other day, and there was a curious phrase. I'm blanking on what the phrase was. But it was something to the effect of God saying, I'm going to use the gold that I gave you out of Egypt, and I'm going to give it to Babylon because you idolized it. And I think the principle that God was telling the people there in Jeremiah, I think it was like Jeremiah 15 or 16 or something like that, is that if you idolize the gifts that God has given you, you end up losing the gifts along the way. The idols destroy your gifts. To whereas if you worship the Lord, your gifts end up being what they are, which are gifts. Basically, let me put it this way. Your career, your family, any other thing you want to put in there, that love thing, you can love them best and you can enjoy them most when they are not ultimate.
Mm.
I think as C.S. Lewis would say, I'm butchering the quote, but if you treat the world as ultimate, you lose the world. Whereas if you love God as ultimate, you will get him and then earth thrown in there as well. So not only is it possible to, enjoy and care about your career and your family and friends and, personal possessions and the temporal things in this life, but I would argue you can only really enjoy them when they are not ultimate.
Mm.
So you can only enjoy your vacation when your existence isn't justified by your vacation. But when your vacation points to something greater. Anyway, I could go through more examples if it would be helpful, but hopefully that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's about, so I mean, the question was, does death make all my other investments meaningless? And you're kind of saying, well, it depends whether those investments, family, career, are kind of, it's almost like if you're deriving your meaning from those investments, then yes, it's going to be meaningless. But if those things aren't what's ultimate, if it's Christ what's ultimate, then you can, then those things
become meaningful.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So a way to summarize it would be death and the resurrection don't make this life pointless. It actually shows you the ultimate point of each of the things. It shows you that they each play a supporting, even if important role in your life and in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
They basically stay in their own lane.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
But also this makes me think it ties into what you were saying before about all humans being immortal beings and passing through in the grocery store, right? It's like an action taken there when you're buying your beans or whatnot, or I'm making up some Lifetime movie scene, right, where the person decides to take an honest action versus a dishonest thing, and someone sees that or notices, and it has some impact. That's probably like the corniest example I could give. But I mean, if you're living out of response to the good news of the gospel, if you're living a life, driving towards glorifying God, that's going to have an influence on those you're interacting with on a day-to-day.
Yeah.
And out of that, there's meaning out of that in terms of the Holy Spirit's impact on their lives. And so I feel like there's meaning just because humans are created in the image of God and have value, and you're in all of those things, all of those investments, you're interacting with other humans, and therefore there's meaning in that when you're pursuing Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think we so often get it backwards. I become a Christian so that I can go further in my career.
Yeah.
It helps me clean up my life so I can be a better worker. I become a Christian, or I hope my kids become Christians so they stop doing stupid stuff so they can be better. Jesus becomes a means to an end rather than the end itself. You're using Jesus in Augustine's language. But yeah, Augustine was, I think, really summarizing a key theme of idolatry throughout the entire Bible. Another thing to point out, I often heard something that I think is very, very, very well intentioned and in one sense true, but I think ultimately insufficient, is you often hear God first, family second, whatever third, I don't know. I think that's, again, in one sense true, but I would say you need to have an order, but it's almost like
you need scale.
Yeah, it's not like a ranking of 1, 2, 3. It's more like something at the end to which everything points. And then, so maybe you could think of like a hub with spokes. What is the central gravitating thing? Maybe the planets. That's the first thing coming. What is the sun of your life, the sun of your life that everything else is gravitating around? So it's not like, God is the first planet. Your family is the second planet. It's like God is the thing that hopefully shapes how you treat your family. And I think the reason why that's important is sometimes I think we often compartmentalize. Well, I've got my God, I've got my Jesus stuff. I need to read my Bible. But then my family is super important, to where sometimes loving God means not focusing as much on your family, or at least worrying as much about your family. Loving God might sometimes mean like opening up the definition of what you even mean by family. Who is my mother and my father? Or who is my mother and my brothers and sisters, but the ones who do the will of God, as Jesus would say. Anyway, I'm digressing, but that's just maybe another framework to add here is to just think of a solar system.
Yeah.
And everything else should orbit around God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's great. We can end there. Everyone, thanks for listening. Once again, we're Center Grace Church here in Beverly, Massachusetts. I feel like if there's one takeaway, it's funny because on a podcast, you're like, they're numbing and they're distractions. And I'm like, go turn this off.
Go think about your death.
Go think about your death.
And then think about how the death is going to die at the resurrection.
Which I don't even know what he just said.
Yeah, that was confusing. The death of death, in the words of John Owen.
See, you're like, yeah, okay. Nathaniel's thought about death a lot. You can tell.
It's just late at night thinking about the day I'm going to die.
And if you don't want to think about death, well, first of all, you go think. Okay?
Read Ecclesiastes.
Go, yeah, read Ecclesiastes. Okay, then you're thinking about death. Just go think. Go do something. Be present. And then, yeah. All right. Thanks for being with us. See you next week, hopefully with Derek.
Yes. Grace and peace.
Bye.